The interrogation room was cold, the kind of chill that gnawed at your skin and made the air feel thick, almost suffocating. Shelby Neely sat there, a cup of coffee in his hands, the steam rising lazily in front of his face. His eyes, empty of emotion, flicked to the detective sitting across from him, someone who at this point was merely another part of the process. Shelby had been caught, yes, but it didn't seem to bother him. He wasn't in a hurry to talk, but when he did, the words came slow, deliberate, like he was recounting something he'd seen on television. "I killed them," Shelby said, his voice flat. He leaned back, taking another sip of his coffee, as if discussing the weather. All of them. Richard, Laura, Nick. The bodies were still fresh in the minds of the detectives, discovered in a home that had been cloaked in a stench of death, a chilling reminder of the violence that had occurred within its walls. But what was most unsettling wasn't the gruesome nature of the murders. It was Shelby's calmness, the way he spoke about it, as though it was the most mundane thing in the world. And yet, he wasn't finished. As the detective waited for Shelby to continue, something shifted in the air, like the pressure before a storm. What he was about to reveal could change everything. This wasn't just a family tragedy. This was the unraveling of a mind, a man who had taken lives in a way that made everything feel wrong, deeper. The chilling confession had just begun, and the room, filled with silence, was about to echo with secrets no one could have ever imagined. The early morning light barely touched the front yard of the Aveni family home, but a sense of dread already hung thick in the air. When the police arrived, they weren't met with the typical humdrum of a routine welfare check. No, something was off. The stench that greeted them told a far more unsettling story than they expected. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud, warning you that the world outside had somehow continued on while time had stopped here. It was clear something terrible had happened. The bodies of Richard Ivani, his wife Laura, and their son Nick lay untouched, in varying stages of decomposition. A haze of decay hung in the air, and the detectives could see that the family's once lively home had become a scene from a nightmare. The walls were smeared with what appeared to be attempts to clean up the blood. A futile effort, considering the severity of the violence. In some places, the rough strokes of paint couldn't quite conceal the dark stains of a long-forgotten battle. The investigators noted the strange chemical smell that clung to the house, as though someone had tried, and failed, to scrub away the horror that had unfolded here. As they moved through the house, trying to piece together the events that had led to this gruesome scene, the missing family car caught their attention. It wasn't just a simple absence, it was a clue. And then, beside the house, they found a shallow hole, hastily dug, as if someone had tried to bury what they couldn't bear to face. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking the usual questions, they were met with a new, chilling detail. A young man in his 20s had been seen digging that hole, accompanied by a child. The description was vivid, and it didn't take long for the detectives to connect the dots. Shelby Neely, the son-in-law of Richard and Laura, was the one they had seen. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. He was the one they had to find. But there was another question hanging in the air, one that had everyone on edge. What had happened to Jamie, Shelby's wife? With no sign of her anywhere, the worst fears began to take shape. Could this be more than just a murder? Could this be the unraveling of an entire family? The aftermath of a secret that someone was willing to kill to protect? It didn't take long for the authorities to track Shelby Neely down. The trail he left was an unintentional one, though it still pointed straight to him. Pawn shops, stolen credit cards, and the Ivani family's missing car. It didn't take much to make the connection. Shelby had used his in-laws' cards, and he was seen driving their car. By January 1st, 2019, he was located in Lakewood, Ohio. A Florida officer flew up to meet him. When Shelby was arrested, he was calm, almost unnervingly so, as though he was a man caught for something trivial, not the triple homicide that had unfolded just days earlier. As Shelby was brought into the interrogation room, his demeanor didn't change. The room, sterile and cold, felt suffocating, but Shelby sat there as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't in a rush to talk, but the detective knew that this was a critical moment. Shelby would either break or remain indifferent. The detective, trying to get some sense of where to start, broke the silence. "We know why you're here, Shelby. You know, don't you?" Shelby, still holding his cup of coffee, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did it," he said flatly, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he was recounting an event that happened to someone else. His words hung in the air, thick and final, but he wasn't finished. There was no panic, no anger, just a calm acceptance, as if the weight of what he'd done had been shrugged off long ago. He didn't seem bothered by the fact that 3 people were dead, people he had once called family. He spoke as though he were explaining a problem that was long solved, one that he had figured out on his own. "I'll really give you that problem, sir." The detective waited, knowing that this was just the beginning of what could turn into an unsettling confession. But Shelby didn't need to be pushed. He was ready to talk. As he settled deeper into the chair, sipping his coffee like it was the most ordinary moment in his life, he began to unravel his story. A story that would reveal not just a murder, but a series of chilling decisions, a path that led from a family's trust to an unimaginable betrayal. And so, without fanfare or drama, Shelby Neely confessed to the murders. His voice was steady, his eyes unblinking. What he would say next would turn the case into something even darker than anyone had imagined. Shelby sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his fingers curled around the coffee cup, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The officers had just finished the grim task of explaining what they had discovered: the bodies, the blood, the shallow grave. And now it was his turn to speak. Shelby's eyes flicked up from his coffee as he exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for a confession that had been years in the making. He started without hesitation, almost too easily. "Yeah," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I did it. I killed them all." The words, though chilling, were nothing compared to the quiet with which they were spoken. His composure was unsettling. As he continued, his mind drifted back to a time before the bloodshed, before the deaths that had scarred his family and ended his life as he knew it. Shelby spoke, not of the murders, but of a childhood that seemed, at first, almost ordinary. Growing up with a single mother and a stepfather, he recalled a life that seemed on the surface filled with the usual mix of love, discipline, and occasional rebellion. There wasn't anything that special about it, he mused, his voice distant as he recalled his early years. Mum was there, Dad wasn't. But it wasn't like some tragic story. His gaze drifted towards the table, not looking at the detective but somewhere far away, almost as if he was searching for something long lost. He briefly mentioned his birth father, who had been absent for most of his life. His real father lived in Texas, and Shelby had only seen him on rare occasions. Despite this absence, he made no mention of trauma, just the confusion of a young boy trying to make sense of his world. It wasn't until his father's death, right before his 17th birthday, that things started to shift in Shelby's mind. "That's when it hit me," he said, his tone shifting for just a moment. "I didn't know how to deal with it. My dad wasn't there, and then, when he was gone, it was just too much. After that, everything changed." Shelby's expression softened, but there was no real emotion there, just a matter-of-fact recounting of events. The detective listened, but something in the air felt off. There was an unsettling lack of remorse or even acknowledgement of the pain his father's death might have caused. Growing up, Shelby didn't feel the weight of mental or physical abuse. He mentioned the usual teenage rebellion, sneaking out, breaking the rules, doing what young people do when they're trying to figure out who they are. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that there was something lurking just beneath the surface, something that couldn't be explained away by the loss of a father or typical teenage angst. Shelby was different. His rebellion, the violence that would later define his life, began to take root in these early years, hidden behind the walls of what should have been a normal upbringing. The trauma. He got into trouble, sure, but nothing really set me off. It was just a normal childhood, I guess. I wasn't any different than the rest," he said, his voice dropping as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else, but the cracks were starting to show. As the conversation moved on, it became evident that Shelby's childhood, though seemingly unremarkable, had planted the seeds for a future full of darkness. The loss of his father, the absence of true emotional support, the slow erosion of his mental state. All of it shaped the man who would one day commit unspeakable acts of violence. The warning signs were there, subtle at first, but unmistakable when pieced together. For the first time, Shelby paused, looking up from his coffee as if coming back from a long journey in his mind. "I wasn't broken then," he said softly, "but I was about to be." Shelby's eyes flicked toward the window, but his mind was far from the bright daylight outside. He didn't seem to notice the detective's questioning gaze, his thoughts lingering on a time in his life when everything seemed to fall apart, slowly but steadily. He shifted in his seat, taking another sip of his coffee as if it grounded him, but the weight of his next words hung heavily in the air. "I met Jamie when I was managing at Burger King in Parma, Ohio," he began, his voice distant, almost reflective. "Her brother worked for me. It was here, in this seemingly mundane chapter of his life, that Shelby's descent into darkness truly began. At first, things seemed simple. Shelby, struggling after his early adulthood, was trying to get by, working in a fast food restaurant, just trying to make ends meet. He wasn't thinking about violence, wasn't planning on the future. But then, Jamie entered his life. It was just one of those nights. I went to her brother's house, and there she was. We hit it off." He spoke with a detachment that bordered on casualness, as though discussing an insignificant meeting. But the look in his eyes betrayed the truth. This wasn't just a simple beginning. Their relationship quickly escalated, spiraling into the toxic, volatile mess that would become Shelby's reality. "The early days were full of typical excitement," he said. "Everything was cool at first." But Shelby's tone betrayed the lie. He didn't seem to remember the honeymoon phase fondly. The cracks in the relationship began showing almost immediately, and soon the once innocent arguments turned into something much darker. She'd slap me here and there. I mean, it's a woman, you know. Sometimes they lose control. Shelby's words fell flat. No real anger, no surprise. Just an unsettling acceptance of what he considered a normal part of the relationship. If allegedly revered in death, it was during this time that Shelby started to notice the changes within himself. His emotions, buried under a layer of coldness, began to surface in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew. I started lashing out. Getting angry, he confessed, barely looking up. I didn't know how to handle everything. The pressure was too much, and then the fights started. And then I hit her. He said it plainly, as though he were recounting an incident that had no real significance. But the weight of his words hit the detective like a punch to the gut. Shelby had hit his wife, and he had done it without hesitation. This wasn't a moment of loss of control. This was a man who had already crossed a line, who had already found a way to justify violence. The marriage ended soon after, but the violence didn't end with Jamie. It only festered, becoming more consuming, as Shelby found himself homeless, living on the streets for nearly 6 months. The years spent in isolation added layers to his bitterness, a bitterness that would come to define him. It wasn't easy, Shelby said, almost as if to explain his actions. But then I met Jamie's mum and dad, Richard and Laura, and that's when it really went bad. There was a moment of stillness in the room, as Shelby's words hung in the air. He leaned forward slightly, a cold glint appearing in his eyes for the first time during the entire interview. They were nice to me, but something wasn't right. They didn't understand me. They didn't get it. His voice dropped, and he shifted in his chair. I had to do what I had to do. They didn't know what it was like, living in the mess I'd created. Shelby's actions began to take shape in his mind, distorted as they were. It wasn't just a desire for control. It was the deep-rooted need to protect what he saw as his own, even if it meant destroying everyone in his path. By the time Shelby moved to Florida with Jamie, the violence had become a silent, underlying presence in their lives. It was there, beneath every conversation, in every heated argument, in every unsaid word. And as the tension built between him and his in-laws, the path to murder became clearer. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of years of unresolved anger, emotional neglect, and a twisted sense of entitlement. I was just waiting, he said quietly, almost to himself. Waiting for the right moment. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing. And then I realized it had to be done. If I didn't do it, I'd lose everything. My kids, my life, everything. Shelby was convinced this was the only way. And as the days passed, and he continued to play the role of the caring father and son-in-law, the seed of violence grew into something far more insidious. All it needed was the perfect trigger. And soon, the moment would come. The air in the house was thick with tension, a weight that had been building for months, but now seemed unbearable. Shelby's eyes shifted uneasily as he spoke about Jamie, his second wife, the woman he had once seemed to care for, but who had become a symbol of everything that was wrong in his life. Their relationship had turned toxic, the love they once shared buried beneath layers of bitterness, anger, and resentment. She wasn't the same, Shelby said, his voice low, almost regretful, but not quite. She wasn't the woman I thought I married. He spoke about her mental health, about her refusal to seek help, about how she'd shut down every attempt to get her professional care. The frustration in his voice was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of frustration that comes from caring about someone. It was the kind that comes from exhaustion, exhaustion that can only lead to one dark, irreversible conclusion. She wouldn't take the meds, he muttered. She thought she didn't need them, said she was fine. He stared into space as if lost in a memory, but the coldness in his eyes never wavered. She didn't want help. She didn't want to listen. Their home, once filled with the ordinary chaos of family life, had become a prison. The tension between them, which had once been subtle and under the surface, now flared into regular confrontations. The cracks that had started small grew wider, the arguments more frequent, the violence more inevitable. "I just couldn't take it anymore," he admitted, but the words held no remorse. Shelby described the final confrontation with a chilling detachment, as if it had been an event that had already been scripted. "We fought," he said simply. "She was on me again, yelling, throwing things, telling me how bad I was. And then I just snapped." His hand clenched into a fist on the table, but there was no sign of anger, just an unsettling calmness. "I hit her. Once. Then I hit her again." His eyes met the detective's for the first time, the coolness of his gaze a sharp contrast to the nature of his confession. The words hung heavy in the room, their impact sinking deep into the silence. Shelby didn't seem affected by the gravity of what he'd just admitted. He had killed his wife. But there was no feeling behind it, no sorrow, no regret. It was simply a fact, as natural as breathing. "I didn't know what to do," he continued, almost absent-mindedly. "So I buried her." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "In the backyard." It felt right. The casual way he spoke about it, the lack of any real emotion, was enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. Shelby had crossed a line that day, a line from which there was no return. His wife, the woman he had once claimed to love, was now just another casualty in a life he had come to see as nothing more than a series of obstacles to be removed. But what was even more chilling was the way he justified it. "I didn't want her to be in pain anymore," he said softly, as if that somehow made it okay. "I was just trying to end it for her." But there was no tenderness in his words, no love. It was the cold logic of a man who had become so numb to the world around him that even his own wife's death seemed like little more than a consequence he could brush off. Shelby had made his choice, and he had followed through with it. Jamie was gone, buried beneath the soil of a backyard that had once been home. And in Shelby's mind, he had done what needed to be done. He had removed another obstacle from his life, cleared the path for his children. His only concern, it seemed, was the preservation of his twisted version of normal. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. The final days leading up to the murders were filled with a strange calmness, a deceptive veneer that hid the chaos lurking beneath. Shelby had spent weeks, even months, preparing for this moment. The act he had planned with chilling precision was about to unfold, and every step had been calculated. His mind, already a place of darkness, now hummed with a singular focus. This was his moment to reclaim control, to protect what he believed was his, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. "You already did," she said, placing her glass of wine delicately on the table. It started on the evening of December 15th. Shelby had already laid the groundwork. The house was still, quiet. The Ivani family, Richard, Laura, and Nick, were gathered in the living room, unaware of the impending violence. Shelby acted as if everything was normal, playing the role of the dutiful son-in-law of the man who cared. But inside, he was preparing for something far more horrific. "They didn't know," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "They didn't know I was going to kill them. But I knew." The words were chilling, spoken with such coldness that it sent a shiver through the detective listening across from him. Shelby wasn't just recounting events, he was rationalizing them, like a predator explaining why it had to hunt. Richard, Laura, and Nick had no idea what was coming. Shelby's mind raced as he thought of his children, his only reason for doing this. They were his protection, his justification for murder. The Ivani family had become obstacles in the twisted world he had created. He couldn't let them interfere, couldn't let them take away what he had. To him, they were threats that needed to be eliminated. Not once had he told Hannah he was taking them. "I had to do it," Shelby said, his voice lower now, almost as if he were convincing himself. "They were a danger to my kids. They were going to take them from me." Shelby's first victim was Richard. He struck quickly, moving with a disturbing speed and precision, the hammer making contact with Richard's head in a brutal blow. "I hit him hard. I didn't want him to see it coming." He described it with an eerie nonchalance, as if it were the most mundane task in the world. Richard fell instantly, unconscious, before he could even register the attack. Laura walked in next, blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding in the other room. She entered the house, her voice light and casual as she headed toward the kitchen, when Shelby intercepted her. "I couldn't let her see him. I couldn't let her see what I had done," he said, a touch of something like regret flickering in his eyes. But there was no hesitation in his action. With a swift strike, he brought the hammer down on her, her body crumpling to the floor before she could make sense of what had just happened. The final blow would come when Nick, unaware of the chaos, returned home. Shelby played the role of the casual relative, even offering him money for a pizza, providing him with weed, sharing a laugh as if everything were normal. He waited for the perfect moment. Nick, tired, eventually settled on the couch, his body sinking into sleep. And when the time came, Shelby rose quietly, moving like a shadow in the dark. He said. And when the time came, Shelby rose quietly, moving like a shadow in the dark. I didn't want him to wake up. I didn't want him to see what I was doing. So I just... Shelby's words trailed off as he motioned vaguely with his hands, miming the act of striking. He paused for a moment before continuing. I just hit him, as hard as I could. The hammer fell again and again, each blow more savage than the last. Blood splattered across the couch, staining everything it touched. But Shelby wasn't finished. There was a method to his madness, a cruel logic to his violence. The family members who had once offered him comfort, even care, were now nothing more than obstacles. And as Shelby stood over them, breathing heavily, he felt no remorse, only a strange sense of finality. I had to do it. I had to make sure my kids were safe, Shelby said, almost to himself, his voice void of any emotion. It was them or me, and I wasn't going to let them take my life, but it wasn't over yet. With the murders complete, Shelby set about covering his tracks. He dug a shallow grave behind the house, burying his in-laws' bodies as if they were little more than trash. He moved quickly, his adrenaline still high, his mind racing with a plan to get away with it all. He hid their belongings, switched their IDs, and carefully tried to erase any sign of what had happened. But even in his frantic state, there was a deliberate precision to his actions, a coldness that made it clear this was no impulse. As Shelby finished his grim work, the house stood quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a man who had destroyed everything in his path, all in the name of what he believed was protection. In the aftermath, there was only silence, the kind that follows an act of horror too immense to comprehend. And as Shelby sat back, staring out the window, he seemed almost satisfied. The finality of it all settled in. The murders, the grave, the lies. It had all come together just as he'd planned. But Shelby had underestimated one thing. The truth always finds its way out. And as the investigation would soon reveal, Shelby's facade was already beginning to crack. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as Shelby paced through the rooms, his mind still buzzing with the adrenaline of the night's events. The deaths were over, the blood had been cleaned, and the bodies were buried. But there was one final step. Shelby wasn't just a murderer. He was also a man who knew how to cover his tracks. He couldn't afford to leave any trace that might point back to him. The clock was ticking, and he needed to act fast. He started by focusing on the details, the things most people wouldn't notice at first, but that could unravel everything. "I knew they'd start looking for anything that would point back to me," Shelby said matter-of-factly, his voice cold, devoid of guilt. "So I made sure to take everything, every little thing." His eyes flicked to the table, and he shifted uncomfortably, as if remembering the meticulousness of his actions. "I took their IDs, their credit cards. I even swapped out the Xbox for a PS4, just to make it harder to trace anything." Shelby wasn't finished. As the weight of his actions began to settle on his shoulders, he knew he needed to cover his tracks completely. His mind, which had carefully planned the murders, now worked to cover every detail. The family's car had to disappear. Their belongings needed to be gone. And "I sold their stuff," Shelby continued, almost like he was talking about a routine errand. "Pawn shops. I used their cards. I needed the cash, and I knew the police would be looking for anything." His voice dropped slightly as he recalled the feeling of desperation mixed with cold calculation. "If I didn't cover my tracks, it would all fall apart." It wasn't just about the stolen items. Shelby had to deal with the burial of his wife's body, too. The backyard of the house was now a graveyard, the place where his wife and his in-laws would remain hidden beneath the earth. But he couldn't just leave it. He'd been paranoid about the neighbors noticing the disturbance. He'd spent hours digging, breaking the task into pieces, bit by bit, so no one would suspect a thing. "I wasn't sure how far they'd go," he confessed. "I didn't want anyone catching on, so I'd go out little by little, cover it up with dirt, cover it with anything I could find." He shifted in his seat, his expression momentarily flickering with something like unease. "I even used some wooden planks to cover the top, anything to make it look normal. I wanted a face, and it's not something that's easy to create without being visible." But Shelby's efforts weren't enough to erase every trace. As he continued his attempts to hide his actions, he realized just how desperate he had become. The mounting fear of getting caught pushed him to take greater risks. He'd taken every possible precaution, swapping IDs, hiding the family's car, cleaning up bloodstains. But in the end, there were always little things that slipped through his fingers. "People don't realize how easy it is to make a mistake when you're trying to cover it up," Shelby admitted, a slight hint of frustration breaking through. "I took their IDs, but I couldn't find Laura's. I looked everywhere. couldn't find it. Despite his best efforts, there were things Shelby couldn't control. The dog that had been left behind, one of the Ivani's pets, was another detail that wouldn't be easily ignored. "It wasn't my fault," he muttered, almost as if convincing himself. "The dog was already sick. I didn't know how to help it. It was dying. So I did what I had to do." He claimed he'd put the dog down, ending its suffering as if that somehow justified the act. It was another step in the careful process of hiding the truth, of making sure no one would question what had happened behind those closed doors. As the days passed, and Shelby continued his efforts to cover up the murders, the tension in the air grew thicker. He had buried his past in the backyard, erased traces of the violence that had ripped through the Ivani family. But somewhere deep inside, he knew the consequences were coming. His plans had been meticulous, but no matter how carefully he tried to erase his tracks, the inevitable was closing in on him. "I didn't think anyone would catch me," Shelby said, almost as though it were a matter of course. "But I was wrong." His expression hardened, and he sat back in his chair, the calmness returning to his face. "I had to get away. I had to be smart." Shelby's cover-up wasn't just about evading justice. It was about maintaining control. He was still in the game, still trying to manipulate the narrative of his life. But as the investigation began to gain momentum, it was clear that his carefully crafted plans were starting to unravel, and no amount of hiding, lying, or covering up would save him from the truth that was slowly inching its way into the light. The weeks following Shelby Neely's arrest were filled with a growing sense of inevitability. What had once seemed like a carefully executed plan to cover up the murders was now crumbling under the weight of the investigation. Every move Shelby had made to erase his tracks, every stolen credit card and swapped Xbox, had only drawn more attention to him. His quiet confidence during the early stages of his interrogation began to crack as the evidence against him mounted. He sat now in the holding cell, the same eerie calmness in his eyes as when he had first confessed. There were no more questions to ask him. He had already provided them all. But the reality of what had happened was just beginning to sink in. Shelby had taken the lives of 4 people, including his own wife, and buried them like unwanted secrets in his backyard. And for what? To keep his children? To protect himself? It seemed, even to him, like a distant justification now. In the cold light of the interrogation room, his rationalizations felt less and less like truth, and more like the hollow echoes of a man who had lost his way long before the murders ever occurred. As his trial drew near, Shelby's story was dissected piece by piece. The defense argued that he had been the product of a troubled childhood, that the violence he had endured and witnessed had shaped him into the man who sat before them. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A man who had methodically planned and executed the murders. A man who showed no remorse for what he had done. A man who showed no remorse for what he had done. They described the chilling way Shelby had spoken about the murders, as though he were recounting an ordinary event, not the brutal deaths of his in-laws and wife. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with the gravity of the case. The jury listened intently as the prosecution outlined the details of the murders. The hammer strikes, the bloodstains, the body that had been buried in the backyard. They presented evidence of Shelby's lies and the desperate measures he had taken to cover his tracks, painting a picture of a man who had been desperate to escape the consequences of his actions. But it was Shelby's lack of emotion, his unsettling composure, that seemed to leave the most lasting impression on the jury. Throughout the trial, he remained stoic, offering little more than the occasional glance around the room. His defense attorney tried to argue that he had acted out of a misguided sense of protecting his children. But the jury wasn't buying it. There was something about Shelby's demeanor, the way he spoke about his wife's death, with the same detachment as if it were a conversation about the weather, that unsettled them. They could see through the facade. This wasn't a man protecting his family. This was a man who had created his own narrative, a man who had chosen to take lives, to maintain control. In the end, the jury was left to decide what punishment Shelby Neely deserved. Should he face the death penalty for the calculated, brutal murders he had committed, or would he receive life in prison without parole, a fate that would keep him locked away for the rest of his life, but never offer the finality of death? The decision was a heavy one, but the evidence was clear. Shelby had taken 3 lives and shown no remorse. He had acted out of a twisted need for control, and now the consequences of his actions would be determined. As the judge read the verdict, Shelby remained motionless, his face impassive. He had been prepared for this moment, just as he had been prepared for every other step in the process. But now, in the cold silence of the courtroom, it was impossible to ignore the truth. The story of a man who had crossed every line, who had destroyed everything in his path, had reached its final chapter. Whether he would die or spend the rest of his life in prison didn't matter. What mattered was that the world now knew what he had done, and no amount of cover-up or justification could change that. The courtroom doors closed behind him as he was led away, and the story of Shelby Neely, the man who murdered his family to protect his secrets, would become a haunting reminder of how easily a mind can break, and how far someone will go to hide their sins. As Shelby was led away, his fate sealed, the courtroom seemed to exhale in unison, as though the collective tension of the past weeks had finally been released. But while his story had reached its legal conclusion, there was something deeper that still lingered in the air. A haunting question that could not be answered simply by a verdict. Why did he do it? Was it truly about protecting his children, as he claimed? Or was there something darker at play? A twisted desire for control that went far beyond the family he'd killed. Even as the doors to the courtroom closed behind Shelby Neely, the mystery of his mind, the twisted reasoning behind his violence, left an uncomfortable silence in its wake. The governor was dead. His body lay in his family's office, and it wasn't just a story of one man's depravity. It was a story about what happens when a person begins to justify their own worst impulses. When the line between right and wrong becomes so blurred that murder seems like the only solution. And for those who followed the case, the chilling reminder was always there. Sometimes, the monsters we fear are the ones we least expect. The gavel had fallen, but the story didn't end with a conviction. It lived on, inside every mind that had watched this story unfold, lingering in the background of every question that went unanswered. As you reflect on the story of Shelby Neely, ask yourself, how much do we truly know about the people around us? What happens when the darkest parts of the human mind remain hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge? If you want to dive deeper into cases like this and unravel more stories that challenge the very essence of human nature, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified about new videos. Stay tuned for more gripping real-life stories, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think could have stopped this tragedy from happening? Your insight could be the key to understanding more of the twisted puzzles in our world.